So, you've decided to buy a motorbike. And what motorbike have you decided to buy? Well, the YZF R125, of course. Regardless of what bike you are actually buying, today I would like to share with you some of my tips for surviving the process of buying a motorbike. Okay, so you've arranged with the seller a date and time for you to go and have a look at this bike. But the process of checking a bike over doesn't start when you get there. It actually starts before you get there. Before you set off, ask the seller not to start the bike before you get there. You want to see what this bike is like on a cold start. What you don't want is to get there for the bike to be warm or for the bike to be running, and then you do the deal, you buy the bike, you get it home, and then the next day you find that the bike doesn't start. And it doesn't start because maybe the battery's dead and you need a new one, or maybe the starter motor's knackered and you need a new one. And then you come to realise that's why the bike was running when I got there. It's because the seller was trying to cover something up. Also, before you get there, preferably before you even set off, you're going to want to check out the MOT history. And you're checking various things. First of all, check that the mileage recorded on the MOT history matches the mileage on the advert for the bike. Most decent sellers, they will, when they're putting their advert together and they're taking pictures, they will put the ignition on and they will take a photo of the mileage. But you also want to check the MOT history to make sure that the mileage has increased consistently. Does the advert say that the bike's got 13,000 miles and the MOT history says the same? Have a look back. Did that mileage creep up to 25,000 and then drop down to 10? In which case the clocks have been changed. Which isn't always a malicious thing, but it is something that you would want to question the seller about. And in that example, if your mileage has suddenly dropped from 25 to 10, then your bike hasn't got 13,000 miles on it, it's got 28, and that should be reflected in the price. Also, on the MOT history, you want to have a look back through the failure points and the advisories. For example, does the bike consistently fail for the same thing every year? In which case, the bike has a persistent problem and it's going to cost you to get it through the MOT. Again, that should be reflected in the price. Likewise, have a look at the advisories. Does the bike have any? Has it consistently got the same advisories? Is there a bunch of advisories on the MOT history that have been left year after year after year and the seller, previous owners, etc. haven't bothered to fix them? Is the bike being sold with a full MOT? Which, it's great if it is, and it's a very good selling point for the seller, and it's great for you the buyer because you're not going to have to worry about an MOT for 12 months. However, does the bike also have 17 advisories on it that are going to cost you £900 to fix over the next 12 months? Again, it's worth checking it out because that full MOT might not be as great as you thought it was, and again, depending on how many advisories that there are, that should be reflected in the price. Next up, I want to talk about first impressions. Now, having decided to go and look at a bike, you will already have an impression of the bike and of the seller. When I went to buy this bike, I'd already had several messages back and forth with the seller. I'd had a phone call with the seller and I had a very good impression of him. Naturally, I had a very good impression of the bike. But when you get there, you're going to get several first impressions. Turning up to buy this bike, I realised that I was turning up to what you would consider a nice neighbourhood. Turned up to the house, very nice house, nicely looked after. And then I met the seller in person, and he gave a very good, very strong first impression. It matched the messages that we'd had back and forth, gave me that consistency and that reassurance. And then the bike will give you a first impression. And I would suggest that when you first see the bike, take it in for a few seconds, take a very quick walk around the bike, and let the bike give you a first impression. Because sometimes the impression is in the detail. If you don't like something, it's probably because something negative has jumped out at you. If ever you've gone to look at a vehicle and you think it's brilliant and you can't quite put your finger on why you think it's so good, it's probably not because loads of good things have jumped out at you. It's probably because nothing bad has jumped out at you. So give the bike a quick walk around, see if anything negative jumps out at you. Has the bike got rusty bolts? Has it got a rusty chain? Are the black panels on the bike faded to grey, which they were on this bike? My first impression of this bike, it was 50-50, which was a shame, because great neighbourhood, nice house, nice seller, the actual seller was brilliant. The bike was a bit 50-50. And then it's worth considering, is this bike being sold by its owner, or is it being sold by a dealer? Maybe it's being sold by a professional dealer. Maybe it's being sold by a private dealer who buys bikes, fixes them, flips them and sells them on. And that's important, because if the bike's being sold by the owner, you can ask questions about how has the bike been, what's it like to ride, get any pros and cons that you can from the actual owner. And when it's actually a dealer, private or business, you don't get to ask those questions. That becomes important when you're looking at service history. Has the bike been serviced regularly? And has it been serviced by a garage and you've got receipts for the work that's been done? Or are you dealing with a man in a shed service history? Which, I don't want to knock it, because I'm a man in his own garage servicing my vehicles. A man in a garage of his own, man in a shed, those service histories can be as good as, if not better, than having a bike serviced at a garage. The only main difference is that you have to trust that the seller has done the work that they're claiming to do. You won't get the same receipts, but you should be able to get receipts for what they've bought. Is the seller telling you, I've just serviced this bike and here's a receipt for the oil that I bought and the oil filter and the air filter, etc, etc, etc. If you turn up to buy a bike and it's being stored in a garage, you open the garage and there they are, have a look around the garage. What do you see? Do you see paddock stands on the wall that clearly do get used? What other paraphernalia can you find? Is there evidence of servicing the bike? Empty oil containers, a box that contained an oil filter, etc. It's still not an absolute guarantee that the seller has done what they are claiming to have done, but it's a good indication. Next up, mileage. Arguably, service history can be more important than the mileage, but both are a factor. My friend Dale, he had one of these bikes and it had 49,000 miles on the clock, which I think is very high for a 125. But he serviced it regularly, and I know he serviced it regularly because when he got rid of the bike, he still had an air filter and a oil filter that was spare, and he gave them to me because he knew I had this bike. So mileage isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's high, but you do need the service history, and it depends on what you have on your list of requirements. As I say, I think 49,000 miles is quite high for a 125, but then I've got 13, so that's my comparator. Would I want to buy a 125 with more than 30,000 on the clock? Not particularly, but I wouldn't necessarily turn it down if it came with a comprehensive service schedule, service history, something from a dealer, from a garage, from an owner that shows that yes, the bike's been used, but yes, it's also been looked after. Okay, so you've got your first impressions and you're still interested. So now it's time to get into some of the detail, starting with the question of, has it been dropped? Unless the bike has been repaired to a very high standard, there will be signs if the bike has been dropped. Starting with scratches, just like what I've got here. Scratches on the sides of your bike, whatever bike it may be. When you've got a fairing, it's so much easier to see. I've got this sort of scratch on both sides, and then there's other evidence like the bar ends. Have the bar ends got scratches on them, paint missing, etc. And then you've got your levers. Levers will often bend or break when a bike has been dropped. The ends of them typically tend to break off, or the lever itself will bend anytime it hits the floor. Check your engine casings for scratches. These ones don't stick out, but on a lot of bikes they do, particularly on naked bikes, or even on some bikes with fairings, like my Daytona. She has a fairing, but the engine cases do stick out, and on one of them there's a scratch down the side from where she's been dropped. Check the exhaust for scratches and cracks to any plastic pieces. I've just ridden down a muddy road, so probably not the best of examples right now, but check any scratches down the side, particularly with the end can. You know, has it got any scratches, and is it smoother on one side than it is on the other? Because if somebody wants to get the best out of their bike and it has been dropped and it has got scratches like this one did, they will have smoothed it out, and you can end up seeing signs that it has been sanded, but again, that's because it's been dropped. Check things like the edges of your pillion pegs, because they often get scratches on them as well. You'll end up with, especially if they're black pillion pegs, and then you get down to here and suddenly you've got a bit of rust because paint came off when it hit the floor, or you've just blatantly got paint missing from when it hit the floor. Check your brake disc, or discs if you have two. This one is often overlooked, and it's rare to have damage on your discs from a drop. But if the wheel is still moving when the bike hits the floor, if that brake disc touches anything, if it hits the floor, if it hits a rock, you're going to end up with scratches along the brake disc, and it goes in kind of like a spiral pattern where you start with a scratch on the outside and it goes inwards. Some spiral is how I would describe it. So check the edges of your brake discs for any scratches from a drop. If you do find any damage, that's not necessarily a reason not to buy the bike, but again, it should all be reflected in the price. It could also be an indication that other hidden damage has occurred. And that takes me on to the steering stop. Hello and welcome to Under the Fairing. Your steering stop is that piece just there. It sits just above your lower yoke or lower triple clamp, depending on where you're from, and you should be able to tell if that piece is missing or bent. The steering stop does exactly what it says on the tin. It stops your bars from hitting your tank, left and right. Now, the gap between your bar and your tank should also be consistent. If your bars are hitting your tank, then you probably haven't got a steering stop. It's broken off. It's an MOT failure because it's dangerous. But if your bars, if you turn to one side and you've got a really small gap, and then you turn to the other side and you've got a big gap, so it is stopping. Maybe it's hitting on this side, but on this side it is stopping, but the gap's huge compared to this side. That probably means that you've got a bent steering stop. If you do have either of these problems, where the bars are hitting the tank or you've got an inconsistent gap side to side indicating a bent steering stop, honestly, just walk away. It sounds harsh, this may be the bike that you want, but I can say from experience that steering stops, trying to repair them, is probably the worst job I've ever done on a motorbike. I had to do the steering stop on this bike and on my Daytona 675. The steering stops were broken and they were different for each bike, and so the repair was different, but they are an absolute pig to do, and I would never ever want to do one again. So my advice would be, unless you absolutely don't care what's involved and you're willing to completely strip the bike down to do the repair, and you've got the time, energy and experience and patience to do that, anything wrong with your steering stop, just walk away from it. Next up, we're going to think about some of the hidden parts of the motorbike. We're back under the fairing, taking a look at the radiator. Now, I have previously had a radiator let go on me. The bike was 18 years old and the radiator was pretty cruddy. So if you can, and it will be easier on some bikes, a little bit more difficult on your fairing bikes, but if you can, have a look at the radiator. And if you're dealing with a crumbling mess, then again, factor it into your purchase price. Then, if you can, locate your coolant reservoir. Check to make sure it's not leaking. Has it been topped up? Is it at the correct level, somewhere between the minimum and maximum marks? Have a look under the bike. Make sure you haven't got any oil leaks. Even on a bike with a fairing, if you had an oil leak, there would be signs of it. The oil would probably gather in the bottom of the fairing and eventually it would drop out. Even on a naked bike, some of those have a belly pan fairing. So check, make sure you haven't got any oil leaks. These were the forks from hell. This one in particular, the right hand one. I bought this bike with a full MOT, and 12 months later we failed the MOT because of the fork seal on the right hand side. So I paid the garage to change the fork seals for me, and then we got an MOT and we were okay for 12 months. 12 months later we failed the MOT again on fork seals. Actually just the one, the same one, the fork seal on the right hand side. So I decided that this time I would take the entire fork off the bike, strip it down to try and find out what the problem was. And it turned out that the stanchion, that's the chrome part of the fork there, it was corroded, and as the fork was travelling up and down, the corrosion was chewing up the seal there and causing it to leak. That chrome part cost me almost 200 quid, so when you're buying a bike, check the fork seals, make sure they're not leaking, but also check for corrosion, particularly just above. Sometimes you might see it, the corrosion could be just below that line where the seal is, and it might actually be out of sight. But if it is corroded down there, you should be able to see the leak. But yeah, check it, make sure your forks aren't leaking. All of these things that we are checking, we're checking to make sure that the bike is worth buying. And anything that you do find, well, those are your bargaining chips. We've just mentioned leaking fork seals. When my friend bought his Cafe Racer, the fork seals were leaking. I will say credit to the seller though, the seller pointed out the leaking fork seals to us. The seller showed us his credibility and his integrity by pointing out those leaking fork seals. Personally, I would like to think that I would have found those leaking fork seals. But we knew the seals were leaking, and my friend then leveraged that significant bargaining chip and offered the seller £300 less than the asking price. And the seller took it. So if you've decided that the bike is for you, get all of your bargaining chips together. Everything that we've mentioned and anything else that you may find. Things that you may not even have thought about before you go to look at the bike. Things like pillion seat, pillion pegs. If you're buying a 125, you may not need pillion seat and pillion pegs. But if you do intend to carry a passenger, some people do like to take these things off. So if you want to carry a passenger, but the owner of the bike's taken the pillion seat off and the pillion pegs, ask them if they've still got them. Some owners keep them, some owners don't. And it may not seem like a big deal. You jump on eBay, oh, there's a pillion seat for sale, 25 quid. Pillion pegs, yeah, 30 quid, not a problem. But that's 55 quid. That's another bargaining chip for you. And now all the legal stuff. You've decided that you want the bike, you're considering making an offer to the seller. Now you want to check, find your VIN number, wherever that is, and ask the seller to produce the logbook. Make sure that the VIN number matches the VIN number that's on the logbook. Make sure that your reg matches the reg that's on the logbook. Make sure that the seller's name and address of the place that you've just gone to matches what's on the logbook. And then there's the keys. Are there two of them? There should be. Don't get me wrong, you can get away with one. And if there is just one key, is it an original key or is it an aftermarket? Because if it's an aftermarket key, does that mean that your ignition barrel has been changed? And if so, why? And if it has, check that the key also fits not just the ignition. Take the fuel cap off. Make sure the key fits the fuel cap. Take the seat off. Make sure that the key also fits the seat. If the key doesn't fit the seat and the key doesn't fit the fuel cap, but it does fit the ignition and it's an aftermarket, then why does the seller have a motorbike where the ignition barrel has been changed and only the ignition barrel? Does this bike even belong to the seller? Possibly a major red flag there. And lastly, last but one thing that I want to talk about that relates specifically to the R125, maybe the MT125, but you typically see it on the R125, is 180 kits. If I was buying one of these bikes and the seller made any mention of the fact that the bike had a 180 kit on it, I'm gone. I'm walking away. 7.5 years I've been into these YZF 125s, and I have seen Marketplace with loads of spares or repairs YZF 125s. Why? Because somebody tried fitting a 180 kit to it and it didn't work. I'm not saying that 180 kits don't have their place. Personally, I've never tried one. I know someone that has, and they said it was great. But these 180 kits, they are notoriously difficult to actually set up properly. And most people who try to fit them get it wrong, and now they're selling a YZF 125 with a failed 180 kit on it. Just walk away from them. Now, I appreciate that I haven't spoken about test riding the bike, and that's because test riding the motorbike would be a complete video in its own right. Today I wanted to focus on specifically the things that you would check when you go to look at the bike, and that takes me on nicely to something called sight unseen. You can now go online, find a motorbike that you want, buy it and have it delivered. And that works really well when it's a dealer, but you can also do the same with a private seller. This is what I did when I bought my big bike. It was a private seller and I sent a company to pick the bike up for me. There are companies, I think they're called Shipley and U-Ship, those sorts of companies, and they will go and pick up a motorbike for you. It is more risky because you have less reassurance because you're dealing with a private individual that you don't know, but it is something that you can do. I paid for my big bike using PayPal, and there was a whopping PayPal fee of, it was close to 50 quid, but it was still worth it for that reassurance. And so if you are considering buying a bike sight unseen, well, apart from the MOT checks, which I would suggest that you still do, apart from those checks, none of these checks would apply.